Hello everyone, welcome to this third and last FREVUE webinar. I'm happy to be with you today for a 1 hour Skype for Business webinar. We will today focus on the topic of the economics of electric freight in urban areas. We will, after this short welcome session, have a presentation of the FREVUE project, and afterwards we'll have the main presentation about the economics of electric freight activities in urban areas. And to finish this webinar, we'll have a 15 to 20 minute session of questions and answers with our speakers. I'm today with my colleague Callum Jones, who together with me is managing the technical aspect of this webinar. And I'm pleased to be with three speakers today, three FREVUE partners. We have Tanja Dalle-Muenchmeyer, who is the coordinator of the project and who is based in London and works for Cross River Partnership. And we have two colleagues from TNO in the Netherlands, Hans Quak and Robert Koffrie, who together were in charge of research activities on the topic of the economics of freight. Just before we start with the presentations, I would like to explain a few things about this webinar, about the technical aspects. So the webinar is recorded, so it will be uploaded on the video will be uploaded on the website after the webinar, so you will be able to see it again and to share it with your colleagues. If you have any technical problems or if you have questions about the presentations you will see, you can type them in the chat box. And for technical questions, we'll try to give you answers as quickly as possible. And for the questions about the presentations, we'll take them either after each presentation, or if they are more general, we'll take them during the question and answer session at the end. So now I would like to give the floor to Tanja Dalle-Muenchmeyer, who will present and introduce the FREVUE project to you. Tanja, over to you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and welcome also from my side. As a FREVUE coordinator, I will provide a brief introduction to the project overall before handing over to the team from TNO. Perhaps in advance, for those of you who have already attended the webinar yesterday on the environmental benefits of electric freight vehicles, apologies in advance, as the introduction will obviously be quite similar. So FREVUE stands for Freight Electric Vehicles in Urban Europe, and this is a 4.5-year project that is coming to an end next week in mid-September 2017. It is an FP7 funded project with a 14 million euro budget and just under 8 million euro funding. At the outset of the project, we knew that electric freight vehicles, so fully electric vans and trucks, had a very important potential to address air pollution issues in urban areas, as well as CO2 emissions. But there was very little data available on these vehicles. How do they perform in daily operations? Are they technically suitable for freight operations in urban areas? What are the economics of these vehicles? So something that we will discuss in more detail today. What are the environmental benefits? Something that we discussed in detail yesterday, and the audio recording of that webinar is available on the FREVUE website. So FREVUE really has its objective to demonstrate the suitability of these vehicles and to provide a first evidence base on how they perform and what their benefits are, and to that way support the further uptake of these vehicles and provide evidence for policy intervention. We are trialling these vehicles across these 8 European cities that you see here on the slide. So that's Amsterdam, Lisbon, London, Madrid, Milan, Oslo, Rotterdam and Stockholm, with the idea to trial the vehicles across quite different climates, so very cold Oslo and Stockholm in winter, and then warm Madrid and Milan, for example, in summer. These issues clearly having an impact on vehicle performance, but also deploying them in different policy settings, and to determine what, how useful these policies are for the uptake of these vehicles. We go to the next slide. Thank you. So this just gives you a brief overview of the consortium we have. It's a large consortium of 32 partners. We were very lucky to work with great partners that were very enthusiastic about putting these vehicles on the road. And in the middle, you see the logistics partners that are actually deploying these vehicles, surrounded by all these other groups, the city authorities, research partners, ICT partners, grid operators and vehicle manufacturers, and then the overall coordination and dissemination team support. So this just gives you an impression of the various vehicles that we have put on the road. There's one more. Thank you. We have deployed just over 80 vehicles that were co-funded. We got data for a few more, so overall 105 vehicles, but co-funded were 80, and they range from just small car-derived vans of under 3.5 tons, all the way up to fully electric 18.5-ton trucks, as can be seen here on the right. Importantly, these vehicles also transported very different types of goods, refrigerated and non-refrigerated. In the FREVUE case, the refrigerated goods were pharmaceuticals, but also post and parcel, food and drink, retail, waste, construction, and other goods. In terms of findings, I'm to keep the introduction quite short, I'm bringing 4.5 years of research findings down to one slide. So it is very simplistic what I'm presenting here, but just to give you an overall impression. So in terms of technical and operational suitability, we find that these vehicles that we deployed are very suitable for most urban freight operations. And linked to that, we also find that the range that is currently available is actually sufficient for most operations, and that's an important point, because at the same time we hear consistently from operators that they ask for more range, but then we find that actually the range is sufficient for most operations. So just to underline this point, the FREVUE survey results show that at the beginning of the deployment of the trial of the vehicle, only 6% of respondents thought that a vehicle range of up to 100 kilometers would be sufficient. Now, after the trial, this increased to 50%. So initially it was 6% who thought that a vehicle range of 100 kilometers would be sufficient, and that increased to 50%. So operating these vehicles for a certain amount of time significantly improves the confidence of fleet managers and drivers in the vehicles. The business case is something that the T&O team will talk about in more detail later today. In terms of attitudes towards electric freight vehicles, they tend to be very positive, and they get even better over time. So as for the range that I mentioned earlier, but also, again, the FREVUE surveys show that fleet managers and drivers became more positive. So fleet managers at the beginning of the trial, only 39% of them thought that these vehicles are good alternatives to the diesel vehicles that they had deployed so far, and that increased to 72%, so from 39 to 72%. So there's a significant increase in the number of people that find electric freight vehicles suitable alternatives. However, so we are finding that they're technically and operational suitability, the vehicles. We find that the business case is mixed depending on the vehicle side. The environmental benefits are significant, and attitudes in general are very positive towards these vehicles. but mostly related to the business case, as Tianlo will present. We still do need policy support, and certain governance changes within companies are required. We are now gradually making the research reports available on the FREVUE website, and they should now all be available within the next couple of weeks. So there's a lot of detail available there, and we also have a number of fact sheets focusing on particular points that might be of interest to you. And we are also now publishing guidelines and recommendations for certain target groups. So all this will become available on the website over the next couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanja. Thank you for this nice overview of the project. Indeed, we have a lot of material that will be made available soon on the website. So in case you have questions or things you want to check, it's either already on the website or it will be uploaded in the next couple of weeks. Now I would like to hand over to Hans and Robert for the presentation on the economics of electric vehicles for city logistics. Hans and Robert, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tanja. Thank you, Tanja, for the introduction. What I'd like to do is I'd like to explain a bit what we did in research in what's called Deliverable 3.2 for FREVUE, and that's on the economics of electric freight vehicles in city logistics. The main question we want to answer is, what are the conditions to get a feasible or a successful business case for electric freight vehicles in city logistics? So there are all kinds of elements that we want to take into account. So what did we do? We analyzed all the different demonstrations that Tanja just introduced. We looked at what was necessary in the value network of this logistics operator or of this transport company using an electric freight vehicle. We made TCO comparison, total cost of ownership comparisons, for different types of vehicles. And we looked at the parts on where you replace a conventional vehicle with an electric vehicle and what kind of changes were necessary. And finally, we looked at the barriers and the challenges when scaling up. So it's nice to have one demonstration, but also we looked at the challenges that were coming for using more vehicles. And I'm presenting the first part, and Robert will take over later. To start with, what we did is for all the demonstrations, we used a business model comparison, and that's basically we looked at the business model of the transport company that was using a conventional vehicle, and that changed it with an electric vehicle within the FREVUE demonstration. So for those of you who are not familiar with the business model canvas, I just explained very shortly here. On the left-hand side, you see all different kind of things that are necessary to offer a service or to make a product, and these things result in a cost for a company. On the right-hand side, on the other hand, you see the customer side, and all the things you do for a customer relate in revenues, and in the middle there's a value proposition. What we did is we looked at the business model of the company using a conventional vehicle. Then we looked at the model of the company using an electric vehicle to see in what elements there were differences or changes. And I will present it now on highlights in the deliverable. We did that for every single company. To start with, it's in partners. What you see is that for the small vehicles, and these are really the small vans, you see that there are really a limited amount of changes. Basically, the electric vehicles are available from manufacturers, for OEMs. You can just buy them. Charging infrastructure, of course, that's new. Instead of fueling your vehicle, you need charging infrastructure, but it's relatively easy. You can use public infrastructure, or you can just plug it in at your depot. It's not a big deal there. What we saw is that there is some closer cooperation with the authorities, and usually, or at least some urban consolidation centers were used in order to deal with range issues. Then for the medium and the large vehicles, so these are big vans or trucks, we see that far more changes. Procurement in FREVUE, it was really difficult to procure the large vehicles. They are not already available for OEMs. Also, the impact on the grid and the charging infrastructure at the depots of the operators was bigger. There were issues because of no OEM offer with maintenance and service to have that in a way for the transport operators. And also here, what was changing is the local authorities became really a close partner for these transport companies operating the electric vehicles. Now, if we look further, key activities, basically the key activity of a transport company is to transport goods, so that didn't change, but what did change was the planning. It became slightly more difficult, is what we learned from the operators, to make a planning, especially so you have usually the fixed routes. These were easy because you know the amount of kilometers, but the uncertainties, if you have to do one assignment, for example, in the afternoon after a fixed route, that was difficult, more difficult to plan because you had to take range into account. Another thing that changed was that there were in some cities, for example, the city of Amsterdam, at policy exemptions, which means that an electric vehicle could use a longer time window or could park in a different area, which made the operations easier. For the rest, the electric vehicles in FREVUE that replaced the conventional vehicle performed similar kind of operations, and I will show that later. And what you of course see in the key activities is that now you need to charge your vehicles, which takes, in comparison to fueling your vehicles, far more time. So you have to make sure that you have that time available. On the next slide, there you see an example of the change in operations. I hope you can see it, but on the left, this is one example of UPS in Rotterdam, and we have a lot of examples of these operators using electric vehicles. On the left-hand side, the top box, you see the amount of you see a comparison to a conventional vehicle on the left and an electric vehicle on the right, and the amount of time that such a vehicle was driven to make operations. This example, it shows data from before FREVUE for the conventional vehicle and for FREVUE during FREVUE of the electric vehicle. So in time, it's not completely comparable because during that period, during the last few years, the amount of stops and the amount of packages that were delivered by UPS in the Netherlands increased. So that also means that there are some operational changes. So you can't completely compare it, but what you can learn from this site is that UPS, basically they make the operations, the route they make are similar in time, also more or less similar in distance, and they were able to do more stops in their round trips because of market developments. So what we learned from that, and that's also what we learned from the other companies, is that you can do the operations with a conventional vehicle or an electric vehicle. It doesn't really matter as long as it is within the range of the vehicle. Then if you look at the key resources, what changes there for the operators, it's of course the type of vehicle. Where you bought normally a conventional vehicle, now you buy an electric vehicle, which means that for the smaller ones, there's not a big difference, but for the larger vehicles, the price difference is really big because a lot of these vehicles are converted vehicles or retrofitted vehicles. So you buy a conventional vehicle first, and you have to have a new driveline in it, electric, which adds up to this cost. So sometimes these large vehicles can be 2.5 times, the electric vehicles can be 2.5 times as expensive as the comparable conventional vehicle. Operational costs for the electric vehicles are lower. So for the electricity per kilometer, it's cheaper to operate an electric vehicle in comparison to the diesel vehicle. Obviously, you need charging infrastructure where for normal fueling your vehicle, there is infrastructure available. What we saw is that there's usually some taxation advantages using electric vehicles, and on the other hand, you see that there is with the operators a lot of uncertainty about the battery lifetime and the residual value of these vehicles. So this, in the end, concludes in cost on the next slide. Basically, you have higher initial investment costs for electric freight vehicles, even with the subsidies from the project. But on the other hand, you have lower cost for your variable cost per kilometer and some higher cost for the charging infrastructure. Having said that, then we go to the other side of the business model. And what we see there is that there are some examples that show the opposite, but basically you see no change in the customer side. So customers were not willing to pay more for a zero emission delivery. What the operators noticed that they could use this electric vehicle for a better image in outside world. Customers, public, noticed quite often that they were running an electric vehicle, but it was not willing to pay more. So that means in the next one that concluding there were no extra revenues. So this means that to have a feasible business case, you really have to look at the cost side, because on the revenue side, there are no changes. The value proposition then, and that relates a bit to the webinar of yesterday, there's no tangible value added for the customer, or at least it's not felt like that. On the other hand, there is a value for society in producing fewer emissions and less nuances. In short, that's combined what we learned from the demonstrations. Now, if we go further, what we see is that we looked at the logistics operator only, and now I show you the network. So this is in the middle, there is the logistics operator with the green box. He's operating, and in the right box with the shipper and the receiver, there you can see the service a logistics operator is providing. So basically, an operator is hired to do a job for the shipper, to bring something from the shipper to the receiver. This logistics operator has then a relation with a dealer network where where the operator buys the electric vehicle. The electric vehicle comes from a manufacturer. Maintenance is arranged via the dealer, which is just the way relations are. Then to fuel your vehicle, you can go to a fuel station. There are just established relations there, established businesses. Now, if you change, what we just saw in the business model canvas is what changed for the operator, but in this network, a lot changes. The one thing that didn't change, and that's what we saw in the previous part on the business model, is the relation with the shipper and the receiver. So still the operator, if it uses an electric freight vehicle, still offers a service for the shipper and delivers goods to the receiver. But the next one is the dealer, and especially for the larger vehicles, something changes here because there are not so many dealers that are offering vehicles. So next to having a new vehicle, the logistics operator is not only experiencing with technical details he doesn't know, range issues that are unfamiliar for him, but also with a new relation with a new dealer and with a new maintenance company and so on and so on. So there's also a lot of new relations there next to the uncertainties of a new product. And if you look further, also from the other part, it's not established business anymore because the charging infrastructure, power networks, there it's all new relations for that logistics operator. And I show this to explain that it's not just changing a vehicle for the operator, but that its entire network changes, and he has to build up new relationships with new partners in order to offer this zero emission battery electric freight vehicle deliveries. Having said that, I continue to sorry, the total cost of ownership comparison that we made based on the different demonstrations in FREVUE. We used at least 3 different companies for this TCO comparison. Sometimes also we used some companies from outside the FREVUE project because then we didn't have enough project partners using, for example, very large vehicles. And then the TCO comparison, it really differs per country per type of operation and so on and so on. So we show generalized TCO comparisons, but it's usually doesn't fit one company. So if you really want to know more, we have to explain a bit on the specific ones, but this is more generalized. What this graph shows is the development of the TCO, the total cost of ownership, of operating a small vehicle, the ones that you saw on the previous slides, the Nissan EMV 200s, for example, where you do on average 60 kilometers a day, which is what came from the data from the operators. And there you see, for example, and we only compare now the dark green line, that's the top line, and the blue line, the light blue line, which is the dark green. It's the cost for owning an electric freight vehicle, and the light blue line, it's a cost. These are the costs for owning a conventional freight vehicle. And if you see, for example, after 1 year, the cost for owning operating an electric freight vehicle are higher than for the electric vehicle, and you see that the gap reduces and reduces. And with the tax advantages and policy advantages and so on that we saw in this project, we see that there is a break even more or less for the smaller vehicles if you do 60 kilometers a day in about 4 or 5 years. And on the next slide we have an intersection on the red line and the yellow line, so that's after 5 years. No, one back. That's after 5 years and after 10 years, where you can see that the left one, it's the electric freight vehicle cost, total cost after 5 years, and then the third bar is the conventional freight vehicles after 5 years, and you see that these are more or less comparable. The conventional cost for the conventional vehicle is slightly more expensive over these years. And after 10 years, so if you can run this vehicle for 10 years and you depreciate it in 10 years, the electric freight vehicle is the cost for operating that electric freight vehicle are lower than for operating a conventional freight vehicle. Now, if you go one slide further, what we see is, of course, these TCO comparisons do depend on the amount of kilometers you make a day. So the slide shows in the top left, if you make less kilometers a day, the break-even point is at a later stage, about 6-7 years. And if you are able to make 90 kilometers on average a day, the break-even point is even earlier, about 3 years. Now, we looked also at the TCO comparison for larger vehicles. The advantage of these small ones is that the small vehicles are available from operators for OEMs. These larger ones, the larger vans are not. We see a similar graph here in the next slide for these what we called medium-sized vehicles. But look at if you look at the x-axis. After 1 year, you can see the difference between the dark green line and the light blue line, and that's the difference in purchase price. And that's partly due to the fact that these are converted vehicles, so you have to put a different driveline in it as additional to the conventional vehicle. If you go to the next slide, we see a comparison of the total cost of ownership, and you see that if you do 60 kilometers a day after 5 years, the costs are higher, far higher still for the electric vehicle. And the nice thing here is that we can show some results of what congestion charging is doing, because, for example, in London, the congestion charge, you get an exemption with an electric vehicle. This is the top gray box. So if you are able to use such a vehicle for 10 years and you pay the congestion charge every year, which is the gray box in the right, then you see that there is a break-even point for the electric freight vehicle and the conventional vehicle after about 10 years. If you go then to one slide further, there are some things that what we learned in FREVUE, for example, that if you have a really large fleet, if you have a larger fleet, you need to invest in the grid as well to make sure that you can charge all the vehicles at the same time. And if you add these costs again to the TCO comparison, then the electric freight vehicle becomes slightly more expensive in operating than it was without these extra costs. So there are a lot of costs that come and can make or break your business case. I go fast to the last cases, and this is what we call the small rigid, so that's like 12, 13 tons trucks. Again, there's no OEM producing this vehicle yet, which means that especially the purchase difference is really big. As you can see here in year one, it can be a difference between almost 2.5 times the purchase price. If you're operating this vehicle longer, the TCO per year become closer together, but in the end, you can see if you look closely that the lines do not cross, so there's not a break-even point if you use the small rigid and you do 120 kilometers a day on average for 10 years. And that's also what the next slide shows. There's really, if you use it depreciated in 5 years, there's a big gap in the TCO. If you depreciate it in 10 years, there's still a gap. It's not so big anymore, but there's still a gap there. This also is true for the what we call the medium rigid. Here you can see two pictures of such a vehicle running in FREVUE. Again, you see on the left-hand side the big difference due to especially the purchase price, and of course the TCO gap becomes smaller if you are able to do more kilometers. So the graph showing the right bottom, that if you do 100 kilometers a day, which is feasible with the battery size that's in this vehicle, the TCO gap is smaller, but still it's very challenging to find a feasible business case at this moment. To summarize this part, then I can say, so for the smaller ones, at the moment, I would say, and especially in the near future, there is a feasible business case. A lot of operations can be done with this vehicle. For the larger ones in the middle, yes, a lot of the operations are feasible with this vehicle because they do a lot of parcel deliveries and last mile deliveries with these type of vehicles. But from a business case perspective, it's challenging, and for the larger one, it's really difficult. Then I come to one last point, and that's in what we saw in FREVUE. A lot of trips were replaced, so you can in advance see which vehicles were able to what kind of round trips they were making, and whether it was feasible to replace such a vehicle, a conventional vehicle, by an electric vehicle. And we also learned that it was sometimes necessary, if you really want to use an electric freight vehicles, to reorganize logistics a bit by, for example, using a cross-dock center, a consolidation center, or an urban consolidation center, or as shows here on the picture, by decoupling swap bodies at the city border. And by doing that, it was showed, for example, for the large truck here at the picture, that it's sometimes feasible to get a business case by including all different kind of things that are part of a logistics concept. So not only the vehicle cost, but also that you have two-man delivery, and if you can do if you can do parts with only one-man delivery and other parts with two men, you save some money on the second man. Or if you can use combination, so two containers in one conventional truck to the city border and then do a round trip in the city, that also saves some money. So in a way, by reorganizing, you can do more in creating a business model than only by replacing. And after that, I give the word to Robert to continue on scaling up.
Okay, hello, welcome everybody. Thank you, Hans, for the introduction, and also Thomas and Tanja. My name is Robert Koffrie. I'm a colleague of Hans, however, working at the T&O Powertrains department in Helmond. And from this department, we contributed to the deliverable V3.2 by looking at possibilities for scaling up the existing FREVUE activities. And we did that in close cooperation with 3 of the FREVUE partners, being TNT, Heineken, and Breitner. And for this purpose, we had interviews with those partners. And we also had one interview with a retrofit company, and we also got insight into the TCO related details from another retrofitting company. So this presentation is based on the insights obtained from them. So in this presentation I will be focusing on the generic part. So we looked at the different cases of those 3 partners that I mentioned. But we really made an attempt to make the approach more generic. So that's what this presentation is about. In the report, however, more details can be found about the 3 different cases. So if we look into the transition towards wide-scale electrification, then we see that many aspects will play an important role when replacing the conventional freight vehicles by electric freight vehicles. And I mentioned a few of them in this slide. So of course, energy cost differences per kilometer, that is really the enabler of the business case. So electricity is typically, or electric driven vehicles are per kilometer typically more economical than fuel driven vehicles. So that's how you can earn back, let's say, the investment that you need to make in the extra investment that you need to make in an electric vehicle. Of course, you need charging equipment, and that charging equipment needs to be depreciated. And how much the investment costs for these chargers depend much on the charging speed. Of course, the depreciation costs are related with that. But of course, if you are able to charge faster, then you can obviously also charge more vehicles. So in the end, if fast charging equipment is highly used, then the depreciation costs can come very close to the slow charging equipment. Of course, there are purchase price differences which need to be earned back during the depreciation time. And that mostly depends on battery size, and battery size depends on the maximum trip length. Of course, the depreciation time itself is also a factor. The longer the time you have for depreciation, the more you can earn back the investment. However, of course, there's something like end of life of battery, and we call that cycle life. So one can also run into that limitation. Of course, depreciation time is also linked with daily and yearly mileage. And that's of course linked with the average trip length and the amount of trips per day. And of course, there are battery costs involved, and also cycle life of the battery is an important factor, as explained before. Payload is also something to look at. Some operations require a certain amount of payload, and that should be facilitated. If not, because, for example, of a too big battery, then more vehicles will be required in the operation, and that will also cost extra money. So there's also something to consider. And when moving to multiple trips per day, then the time available for opportunity charging also becomes a factor. Typically, there is time for overnight charging, but we have already seen applications, I think not within FREVUE, but outside FREVUE already, that some vehicles are only standing still for 4 hours, so that's already quite short. And that means that slow charging is not that slow anymore if you want to electrify those operations. So we can go to the next slide. Yes. So the focus of the upscale activities is a TCO neutral upscaling of 3 gross vehicle weight classes, being the 3.5 tons, the 13 tons, and the 19 tons, representing the vehicles that the FREVUE partners with which we cooperated already have. So that's TNT is driving in the 3.5 ton class with their retrofitted Ducatos by BD. The 13-ton vehicles are produced by manufacturer or retrofitter Ginav, and their product is based on the Mercedes Ateco. And the 19-ton vehicle from Breitner is being produced by Amos, and it's based on the MAN TGM. So we are going to discuss in the more generic conditions for replacing these commercial conventional fleets. And typically they use or presume the retrofitted vehicles in their with their original configuration, also for cost comparison. And we will focus on the most important aspects first in order to get a feeling about the business case potential. And as we are looking into the future, we need to make a lot of assumptions. So therefore, we think that it doesn't make very much sense to add a lot of fidelity in the beginning, whereas for the future we already have, let's say, not too much of fidelity. Yeah, you can go to the next one. Thank you. So our approach is to come up with both generic and simple enough, as well as insightful mechanism for explaining the TCO aspects towards this wide-scale electrification. So the first simplifications that we have made in doing this is to combine the charging infrastructure costs and the electricity costs, and also to consider mileage instead of depreciation time, daily mileage, and working days per year, because those are all variables. Yes. So if we simplify things enough, then a TCO neutral, non-subsidized approach boils down to the balance of energy cost benefits versus the battery costs and the conversion costs, where, no, not yet. One slide back, please. The considered vehicles in the 3 cases were all converted vehicles, so there we have these conversion costs. But we think that once OEMs start series production of electric freight vehicles, then of course these conversion costs will disappear, and then these conversion costs will be replaced by the difference in vehicle costs between an electric vehicle without a battery and the conventional vehicle. And by looking at bills of material, we have the feeling that if the series production really picks up, that these costs will disappear. And then that would mean, in that case, that the battery costs are for the series products the main distinguishing factor. So if you look at current vehicles, like for example the Nissan, the ENV 200 and the NV 200, then still if we subtract the battery price from the electric Nissan, then still you see a difference in price of something like 50%, so still significant, but that's going down, and we already have seen that trend in the past. So that gives some confidence that that's actually what we're heading at. Yes, next slide. So to start with, of course, we need assumptions, and in fact, all assumptions are wrong, but hopefully they are not too wrong. And so for the 3.5 ton vehicle, we presumed an energy consumption, a fuel consumption, and energy consumption. And we also presumed for the majority of the cases that I will describe the battery system as is being used by the partners, which means the 62 kilowatt-hour battery system for the 3.5 ton TNT vehicle and the 120 kilowatt-hour battery for the Heineken vehicle and the 200 kilowatt-hour battery for the Breitner case. If you look closely, then one could see that there is a constant factor, or we presumed a constant factor between the fuel consumption and the energy consumption of the electric vehicle, and that's the factor 3.5, and that's a factor that we observed also in the FREVUE measurements. But I must say that factor 3.5 really varies between 3 and 4, so there is some variation there. Furthermore, and that's the previous slide still, we presume for slow charging an extra depreciation value per kilowatt hour of 1 cent. And that's due to depreciation of the charging equipment. For fast charging, we presume a higher depreciation of 5 cents. And the 1 cent is based on the operator owning the slow charging equipment, and the fast charging is based on a commercial supplier of the fast charging service. And of course that part will also make a profit. So there's room for cost down here if there's an operator who can install a fast charger himself and make use of it in a good way, in an optimal way. Then this depreciation cost can be lowered. So it's a pessimistic side of the spectrum. For the battery price projections, we did some research on the internet, and there are many sources coming with battery price projections, and there's quite a deviation between those. And we have the feeling that especially the higher price estimates are targeted for, let's say, small series battery packs. So also in the talks with the retrofitting companies that we had, we know that their purchase price is quite close, let's say, to the upper limit. Whereas typically we see that the lower cost projections are made by companies like Tesla, for example, who are really into electric car mass production. So for this work, we just took the average between these projections. Furthermore, we also, so if you push the next one, then you see, yes, that's the mean value. So we use the line between the blue and the green part. So also for the battery life, we presumed some a battery life also coming from literature, and there we also presumed improvement for the coming years. And furthermore, we also looked at diesel and electricity prices, and also there we discovered that there are already quite some differences within Europe right now. So if you indeed, you can go to this one. So if you look at, for example, the electricity prices, and this is for small companies and households, this is including VAT, there you see that there are really huge differences, and these differences can really make or break the business case. So, and what we observed is that the differences in electricity are way higher than the differences in fuel prices, although also there are quite some differences. So if you go to the next slide, there we see the prices, the electricity prices that the big industrial companies are paying. By the way, this information is coming from a report from Koffrie, which was executed in 2015. And this is also for companies who use more than 2 gigawatt hours annually. But also there you see quite some differences still. And these prices are excluding VAT, so taxes. Yes, so if you go to the next one.
Excuse me, Robert. We are running a bit late, so we have approximately 5 minutes left until the end of the webinar.
Okay. Then we will skip this slide because this is dealing with those numbers. This is, I think, a very interesting slide. It shows how fast you will earn back money, and that depends, of course, on the amount of kilometers. And so that means that for a 3.5-ton vehicle, if we are at 250,000 kilometers, then the cost benefit will be between 12 and 17 kilo euros, depending on whether fast charging is being used or slow charging. And for example, also for the 19-ton vehicle, this will be between 30 and 41 kilo euros. So if you go to the next slide, and please notice the difference, because now we are moving to the Sweden case. So the previous one was the European average. Now we're moving to the Sweden case. In Sweden, the fuel costs are relatively high and the electricity costs are relatively low, giving a maximum difference. And there you see that with the same cases, so the 3.5 ton, you will earn back 22 to 25 kilo euros in 250,000 kilometers, and between 53 and 65 kilo euros with 250,000 kilometers, which is 20k more than the average European case. So now if you go to the next one, here you see the German case, and I must say here in the German case I took the household, so let's say the small company, and excluded the VAT. So this is really a worst case situation, but in Germany fuel prices are relatively low and electricity prices are relatively high, and there you see that it's actually not possible to make a business case with the projected energy prices, and that's because the battery needs to be depreciated. And I also have drawn in this graph the well, first I would like to mention that for fast charging there's even a negative business case. So if you're fast charging and you have this 5 cents per kilowatt hour that you need to pay to the fast charging service provider, then the electric vehicle cannot be more expensive than the conventional vehicle. And if you take the battery depreciation into account, which is shown by the dotted graphs, then you see that actually the lines should be above that. And that is here not the case. So that it's really important to make the check, the energy price check beforehand, because it will break or make the business case. So if you go to the next one, a lot of tables here, and it shows per vehicle class the converted and the series, the prices, or the purchase prices of the converted and series produced electric freight vehicles, thereby presuming for all those vehicles a fixed range of 150 kilometers. So these are no longer the vehicles from the partners, but vehicles with different battery sizes. We presume different prices per kilowatt hour at a battery pack level, and then you see that for the converted vehicles you really need to drive many kilometers in order to get a TCO neutral situation. So in practice that will mean a very long depreciation time, and with a limited battery capacity. So suppose you have only you only have one slow charging event per day, so in fact one trip, then it will take many years, more than 10 years, to earn back the investment. Whereas if you go to a series produced vehicle with only the battery to be earned back, which is really the very much upscaled situation, so the reality will probably be somewhere in between, especially in the meantime. Then you see that if you apply fast charging, then it could be such that already after already after 65,000 kilometers, you could have earned back your investment. Of course, it very much depends on battery prices, and that is shown in the tables underneath. But I would like to
excuse
go
me,
to
Robert.
the conclusions. Yeah?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Yes.
Conclusions. So conclusions. Electrified vehicles can perform city logistic operations in daily life. That has been proven also by the FREVUE partners already now. TCO comparisons show that a positive business case is possible for small electric freight vehicles under circumstances, and in the future for medium electric freight vehicles. A positive business case for rigid electric freight vehicles is not yet feasible. Yeah. Also, current demonstrations mainly replace electric freight vehicle, which are feasible with the current round trips. But in general, it can be stated that if there's more space, time, and also space available for fast charging, then this should be used. Typically we see that distribution centers where goods are being loaded and unloaded are likely candidates, since there the truck is typically standing still for some time. The TCO cap, which is currently there and which is quite big still, is expected to decrease. We have seen that energy prices really affect the potential business case, and different charging schemes combined with smaller battery packs can make the business case positive, or can help reducing the depreciation time. And fast charging is a means to do just that, and it also helps to reduce the initial investment and to avoid extra costs due to the reduced payload capacity. So we go to the next one, and that's the last one of the conclusions. TCO comparisons show that non-subsidized positive business cases for an electrified vehicle are possible if the cost per kilometer exceeds the extra depreciation cost per kilometer, where the cost savings can be approximated by the following formula. So this is a really nice formula, and if you rewrite it a bit, then you can get rid of the electricity consumption and replace that with the battery life, basically, which gives the lower formula, and of course this 0.093 suggests a very high accuracy, but it's just based on the figures there. But you see that if you have if the battery, recycling your battery, costs around 9 cents per kilowatt hour, which is in this case the case, then this formula applies. So you can just do a sanity check on fuel price versus electricity price and check whether there's a potential business case. So the last slide, which is the challenge for the near future. So we conclude that a short-term market stagnation where transport companies are waiting for robust OEM products, especially for rigids, can be anticipated, given that they are faced with uncertainties on the purchase of higher priced products from conversion companies. Yeah, especially after, for example, Mercedes announced that they will be coming with electric freight vehicles. We see that operators are less willing to invest in the high-priced, retrofitted vehicles, and it seems like that is stagnating the market, and that's not desirable since there's a significant optimization potential by a combination of smart fleet planning and optimal charging regimes, and also the charging infrastructure and making progress in building up a charging infrastructure. For that, it's also required that the market goes on and new electric vehicles are being purchased. So here we think that national and more localized legislation or incentive programs could play a significant role in encouraging the uptake of electric commercial vehicles in the coming years. That concludes the presentation. Sorry for being late.
Thank you very much, Robert and Hans, for your presentations. I see on your last slide that indeed you remind all the participants that more information is available either in the deliverables and reports, and also in a more compact format in the fact sheets that will be that are or will be uploaded on our website. During your presentations, I noticed a few questions, so we will be very quick as we are running late. There were questions about the TCO calculation and what do they take into account or not. I saw that Hans gave an answer to these questions, but basically the questions were about the TCO. Do they take into account the overnight charging of fast charging? And also if they take into account the battery degradation. Maybe Hans, you want to give a more detailed answer?
I will give a short answer, and that's we varied quite some things, but the basis in the TCO was based on data that we retrieved from the operators. So in case the operators would value or make a business case, make their business case, for example, putting the residual value on 0, we also did it, but then later on we varied it during some analysis. Overnight charging, we didn't look at it actually. We did look at it, sorry, but fast charging was hardly used in the FREVUE demonstration, so we didn't look at that. But that was later done by in the chapter that Robert presented. So we varied quite some things, and it's too much now to go into detail on all the different TCO comparisons. They can be found in the deliverable, and if there are specific questions to some of these things, we can explain, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much to all the participants for joining this webinar. Thank you again to Tanja, Hans, and Robert for their nice presentations. Apologize for the slight delay. Once again, you can find more information on our website, www.frevue.eu, and in case of questions, feel free to send me a message or to send an email to the speakers of today. You can find their email addresses in the webinar's presentations. The webinar will be put online in the coming hours. Thank you very much and have a good day. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.